This talk is going to include Webpack, right? If you're not pushing your teams to use Webpack, I think you're making a big mistake. I really think this is a part of the future. And overnight, I've violated every best practice and put Webpack into LearnDot. And so, all right. While people are still migrating, I have some funny JavaScript jokes. Okay. So based off Larry's talk earlier, what do you call? What do you? What do you call? What do you call it when you use a tree structure to make yourself feel better by fixing a bug? A console log. Oh, there you go. I just made it up. Okay, okay. A plus, A plus. Okay, A plus spec joke. All right, so that was another one. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Harris Robin Kalash and Christian Sakai, and then we talk about kind of. When they sent me this talk, I was like, "This is amazing." Bleeding edge front end development practices, and how to start using them.
Hey everyone, my name is Christian Sakai. I'm working for 9beat with David Chang right there. So 9beat is a social platform for musical instruments. So if you have any musical instruments that you don't use at home, you can go to 9beat and sell it there.
And I'm Harris. I work for a Canadian startup called Third Shelf. We do big data for retailers. So today we're at work coming out of Full Stack. We're both Full Stack alumni. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, cool. We came out of it, knowing Angular, Node, and all that cool stuff. And as a result, that's what I use at work. That's what we're both familiar with. And I think if anyone's reading anything on web development today, you've heard all the buzzwords about Webpack, React, and so what me and Christian wanted to do is we kind of wanted to put all those buzzwords together and see if we like it. So, so basically, before I start, I just wanted to kind of talk a bit about the front-end environment. I mean, a lot of us probably already know this. The front-end environment is constantly changing. You have to worry about so many things between new devices emerging and standards and features being developed along with a fast-paced implementation in some browsers, but not necessarily in others. There's always something new to learn and fix or do. There's a lot of options to choose from with best practices and patterns and frameworks constantly evolving and changing. Front-end can be overwhelming. It has a steep learning curve. Something like Angular, in my opinion, has a very steep learning curve. There's a lot of stuff you have to learn. And also, today there's more work that once belonged on the server that is being moved to the client, and that's nothing new. But as a result, obviously, things like design patterns matter, and architecting solutions in a good way is important. Testing modular code. So when we hear about things like React, Webpack, and all these things that allow us to do these, we're obviously very interested. So if you're looking to do front end today, I'm pretty sure you're going to look at these contenders. You've probably looked at Ember, AngularJS, Backbone, React, and you'll notice green React is surging. Angular obviously still dwarfs everyone, and actually one of the alumni had a pretty good point about that when I was studying here, saying that the reason Angular dwarfs everything is because it's so hard to use that everyone's Googling for help. So so take it with a grain of salt. But yeah, so, wrong. Yeah, so why is React so popular? In my opinion, it's so popular because it broke the most fundamental conventions we have in front-end web development today. It broke things that we thought were best practices, and by breaking those conventions, React kind of unleashed a shockwave on the web development community and reopened basic questions that were forever closed and allowed us to rethink best practices. One good example of this is, who would have thought that CSS Tricks would ever make an article that's debating whether we even need CSS anymore on the web. So, That's like it wasn't really fun for me to read that article because CSS was like the first thing I ever. but but it's a good thing because we're used to certain things, and you know I'm like we use SAS at work. We're used to certain things, so when something new comes, sometimes we're like skeptical, but change is good. So this is where we come from. And this is kind of a list of like our frustrations with these technologies, and I think this is what full stack students are most familiar with. At least that's what we're learning. And yeah, so now I'm going to pass on to Christian. He's going to talk about React.
Okay, so basically, first of all, I'm going to mention that JavaScript frameworks are actually evil, because yeah, when you think about Angular, I've been doing Angular for maybe close to 1 year now, and then there are a lot of things that I wish could have been done better. For example, Angular is really hard to test. I never test my Angular applications. I don't know how many you guys have. It's really hard to, okay, yeah, because he's more experienced than me, and I'm just too lazy. So it's really hard. I think you have to mock everything. You have to mock the controllers, directives, and everything. It's like too much pain. And you have to do your stuff Angular way, or like for any frameworks in general, you have to do this stuff Rails way, Angular way. And learning frameworks is actually harder than learning languages sometimes. It takes a lot of your time. And it's harder to integrate with other libraries because you have to do it the Angular way in order to, like, for example, make drag and drop to work, something like that. And you have to wait for some other people to implement the packages and then wait for the bug to be fixed, and a lot of stuff. It's just a headache. You can be faster at development. You can be slower too. It's really easy to start your application with Angular or with any other frameworks, but after you want to scale or you want to add some features, it starts to get harder and harder. And so yeah, so basically, and you usually have overkill features that you don't need. I remember that when I was a teaching fellow at Full Stack, there's this one day that I think one of the cohort had to learn Backbone. And then all of the teaching fellow were forced to learn Backbone in one day. And the morning after, we had to teach it to the cohort. Nobody understood anything. It was a disaster for 2 days. Like, nobody knew. The help tickets were all going all over the place. So, yeah. AngularJS is also slow due to a lot of things. For example, like it watches a lot of things, and it do like string parsing on the fly to check your dependency, check your expressions. So that makes it slower. And it also doesn't have server-side rendering. So why React? So again, React is really small. It's just a view rendering library. And because it's just a function that actually outputs a view, or maybe a string of a view, it's really easy to test. It's better performant than most client-side frameworks. And server-side rendering, because it actually just outputs a string. And also even better performance with unidirectional data flow, such with patterns like Flux and Redux. We'll talk about that later. But the cons are you can't use it by itself. You need to have a pattern to use it. Hence, that's why we're going to talk about Redux later. Okay, basically, Redux. I don't know how many of you guys tried Flux. I tried like twice, and I don't really understand Flux that much. I think it's all right. It has a lot of boilerplate code. I definitely just did like some simple to-do app with Redux. I did not even consider making async calls or a lot of things. It was okay. But then I came to learn about this Redux. I think it was really interesting because first of all, the learning curve is easier than Flux. And because it's just pure functions, it's actually really easy to test. You can literally test your whole app just with functions without actually have to mock a lot of things. And so the difference between Redux and Flux is Redux only has one store, which is a single sort of truth for everything. For example, this one store stores your user interaction, like click form or like this, or maybe like has logged in and a lot of stuff. It's like it stores it in a singleton. While Flux actually has different stores, so you can imagine actually there are a lot of like you have to integrate all of those. And managing those application state is hard because you end up requiring a lot of things. and while you only need one thing. I remember when I was a teaching fellow, most of the debugging, a hard debugging that I used to find is mostly consisted of like mutation of objects, because in Angular, two-way data binding, you can pretty much mutate your objects or any data model everywhere in the app, so you don't know what's going on where, and it's really hard to debug. And because with Redux, it's actually just one state of the app and then being called a function. So you can imagine that this object, this one state, being called and then put it into function. The function is called, for example, like this item. And it outputs another state of the application, which already has a like of that particular item. So it means it's really easy to actually implement something like a time travel for development purposes. So you can undo your action, you can redo your action, like you can do undo how many times as possible. So it's really easy to just actually hydrate your app using server side. Hydrate your app within for a certain state, and then boom, your app is right there, like being recorded as what it's supposed to be. It also implements easy async due to its nature. Thanks.
Yeah, so Webpack, we're not going to be covering it in full detail. We're covering some stuff, but basically what you need to know is Webpack basically describes itself as it takes a bunch of modules or dependencies and generates static assets representing those modules, right? So Webpack is the motivation behind Webpack, and you'll see this on their website, is because it's more suitable for larger projects because it supports things like very easily, like code splitting. And it also handles everything. So it handles your CSS, your images, your HTML, and your JavaScript, which allows for some really nice things. One of them being local CSS, which I'll cover later. Something we also tried, because I don't know if you guys have read that article, The End of Global CSS. So that pushed us to try it. And it allows you to focus on everything concerning component you're working on in one place, right? So, yeah. So actually, yeah. So basically, first thing I want to talk about is local CSS, actually. So have you ever inherited a project where you have like this huge manifest of Sass files, right? And you don't really know what's being used and what's not, and what's being deprecated. Like, usually it's like, never mind. I was just going to show you a huge manifest of Sass files, but it doesn't. You don't. Yeah. So you don't really know. It makes it hard to whatever. It makes it hard to know what to deprecate in your CSS code, and you're scared to touch anything because you don't really know what styling you're going to affect somewhere in the application, and we all know CSS is global. It causes a lot of problems because someone probably is overriding what you're styling. Like some guy is going to probably style button. And then whenever you're going to want to style button, you're probably going to have to override something. And so unless you use like the BEM or object-oriented CSS like properly, you're going to run into these problems. And CSS is tricky because of CSS specificity. So enter Webpack. So you can see that in your component, you require your CSS file related to that component, right? So the CSS loader, so Webpack offers functionalities through loader, offers something called a local CSS. So by wrapping your class name in this local syntax, it basically generates this over here, which is a hash of the class. And this makes sure that whatever styling for these class names you write are only limited locally to your component. So this makes it impossible to pollute other components or global namespace, etc. So why is Webpack more popular for large single-page applications? Again, code splitting is basically you define split points in your code, and Webpack will basically output chunks of your code rather than one bundle, which is what it usually does by default. And this is really cool because when you have chunks of your code, you can actually load like the critical path chunk, so you can load only what the user needs to have, like the first thing show up on the screen, which makes it really fast, and load the rest on demand, right? Also, it allows you to use NPM on the front end, so you don't have to have like Bower, JSPM, you don't have to have like several package managers at the same time. So you can just stick with NPM on the front end on the server, and that's really nice. Yeah, so also I'm going to talk a bit about PostCSS. I think this personally is like, for me, this is one of the most interesting thing, and I think it's really cool because the problem with having things like Sass and Stylus is you're kind of like forced into a set of rules, like a set of syntaxes, and PostCSS kind of like simplifies it and pretty much allows you to have the best of both worlds. So I don't know how many of you have heard of PostCSS. Maybe can we just get like a raise of hand? Has anyone heard of PostCSS or? Okay, so yeah. So PostCSS itself is very simple. All it is, it's a parser and a stringifier, and you basically give it your CSS file, and it parses it and outputs a tree, and then all the functionality that PostCSS actually like all the functionality out of PostCSS is actually a bunch of JavaScript plugins in the middle that you write, right? So you can imagine, and you know, it goes through the stringifier, out comes the new CSS. Okay, so we're gonna speed it up a bit. You can imagine how easy it would be to write something like auto prefixer with PostCSS, right? Because when you have your tree, you can basically go through it and do whatever transforms you need and add the vendor prefixes that you need, and then it goes through the stringifier, and there you have auto prefixer. Some really cool plugins actually in PostCSS. So if you're familiar with Sass, obviously you take for granted you have like variables, you have for loops, etc. And all these are offered as plugins in PostCSS. So if you need something like conditionals or variables, you just npm install it, and that's really cool because you can choose exactly what you want. There are some really cool plugins like CSS Grace, which will actually go ahead and go through CSS, make sure it's okay for older browsers without you having to worry about it. So a simple npm install. Alibaba actually uses it, and I'm not going to go through all the plugins, but yeah, you'll be able. So actually, what we're going to do is we're going to jump to a demo of what we're talking about, and I'm going to pass it on to Christian.
All right, so basically we're trying to, like what we said before, frameworks are evil, and that's why we're trying to just make us and match our own libraries and make our own thing. So we have this repo on GitHub. Sorry? Oh, it's okay. Okay, so me and Harris, we created this repo just for examples and play around. We have different branches here. But mostly, this is just an implementation of Redux that we're trying to do. If you guys want to learn about Redux, you can just clone this repo and then check out the different branches here. And just try to make the test passes. And it already passes, but try to redo it based on the test guidelines. Here, I'm just going to demonstrate how do you make this bigger?
On the command.
All right. Okay.
But you have to do it a bunch of times.
All right. I hope you guys can see this. Okay.
Command plus.
No, command plus doesn't work.
You have to do.
All right. Anyway. All right. Oh, it's okay. Okay, so I'm just going to demonstrate why server-side rendering React is really cool. This is built with Redux patterns and using React. And I'm just going to start right here. npm start. Okay. If you are using Angular and then you have to render your application on the client, basically, without JavaScript, what do you think you will get? You just get the HTML with div, ID, root, app, and then just script bundle and everything, right? But what if I use server-side rendering in React and then just disable the JavaScript right here? Okay, so. All right, it's still rendered, so even though the functionality doesn't actually work. But the point is for SEO, search engine, and for actually bootstrapping your app. And what's interesting is, if you look at here, if you like inspect this element, you see all of this React ID. And suddenly, if you activate the JavaScript, where is it? No, I mean, where is my, okay, there it is. So what will happen is React will do a server-side rendering, and you see the bundle right here. React knows which part of the DOM that has been rendered, and then which React ID that it has. And it tries to reconcile the React ID on the DOM and on the JavaScript file. And it will mount the JavaScript file. So basically, you will get the best of both worlds. You get the server-side rendering, which is really fast. You get the HTML and CSS display right away for SEO. And then on the side, React mount itself to the DOM, which basically will activate a lot of things. Activate all the functionalities. It still doesn't work. Oh, sorry, I have to refresh this. Yeah. Okay. And you see right here, basically when I refresh this, see this? This is still here, all the data. This is done by hydrating. It's called hydrating in Redux applications, by hydrating the state of the application and just make it live on the client side. So it's just really cool. That's pretty much it.
All right.
Thank you.